Hey there, micro friends. Welcome to another episode of Let's Talk Micro. As always, I hope you had a great week. And if this is the first time that you're listening to Let's Talk Micro, well, thank you for choosing it as one of your podcasts. Okay, let me tell you a little bit about the episode and then we'll go ahead and jump into it. So, as you know, as a microbiologist, you're familiar with the CLSI M100 document, which updates yearly. So, in this episode, I am joined by Dr. April Bobenchik to go over the latest updates for this year's 2026 edition. So in the episode, she talks about, which breakpoints were updated, which ones were removed. We also talk about Burkholderia cepacia complex. So definitely a great episode if you want to catch up with what the latest updates are. So let's go ahead and listen to it. Hey, micro friends. As you know, every year, the CLSI M100, right? A document that I'm hoping that if you're working on the bench and you're in microbiology, you should be familiar with it. At least know some things, and if not, know where it's at, right? But we last year we did an episode with the updates. So every year the M100 releases the new updates, and we thought it would be a good time to go over them. So just like last year, and she's been in the podcast before, I have Dr. April Bobenchik joining me. April, welcome back.
Thank you. Thanks for having me back this year. I'm excited to talk about this year's updates from the M100. I am the medical director of the microbiology and virology laboratories at Penn State Hershey Medical Center. I also am a member of the CLSI subcommittee on CLSI subcommittee on susceptibility testing, and I co-chair the text and tables working group responsible for updating the M100 document every year.
Once again, welcome back, and we'll be going over the updates. And one thing, for those of you listening, and I was telling this to April off camera that she's been a guest twice before, and the first episode I invite you to check it out. It was an overview of what CLSI is and the M100, and then she joined us last year for the 2025 updates. But one thing I have never asked her is her favorite bug. So I am curious and eager to find out what it is. But of course, as you know, we do that at the end. Thank you for your introduction. So let's go ahead and start with a quick overview of what changed this year from the CLSI M100.
Yeah, sure. So we've had a number of breakpoint changes this year. One of the biggest was the addition of the aztreonam avibactam breakpoints for the Enterobacterales group. We revised the dysdiffusion and MIC breakpoints for aminoglycosides in the Acinetobacter species. We made an addition to the suffixine and ceftriaxone breakpoints for Neisseria gonorrhea. Previously, there was only susceptible breakpoints, but now we have intermediate and resistant breakpoints due to emerging resistance throughout the world, not so much here in the US, but outside the US. We removed the ECVs for the Burkholderia cepacia complex. Also new this year, we added a breakpoint for trimethoprim-sulfa and beta-hemolytic strep, something we'd never had before. And probably one of the biggest updates that's not a breakpoint change or addition was the update to the anaerobic antibiogram. This is like all new data, the old data in the antibiogram. Anaerobic antibiogram before was several years old. This is now contemporary data, and we added in about 5 new additional tables with a lot more anaerobic organisms and additional drugs. So that's like really exciting if you perform anaerobic susceptibility testing, or maybe you want to get into anaerobic susceptibility testing, and this is a great resource to use for your laboratory.
Perfect. And out of these changes, and of course, all the changes are always important. But sometimes, depending on the year, there are some that kind of stand out more than others. I remember, like last year with Burkholderia cepacia complex, that was a big thing. Complete removal of the breakpoints, and we'll talk more about that. So for this year, this edition, out of those changes, what do you think will be like have the biggest impact in clinical microbiology labs?
Mm, well, definitely, breakpoint changes always have huge impacts on patient care. The aminoglycosides for the Acinetobacter, certainly something you want to update if you're doing susceptibility testing for these organisms. Actually, in our lab, we don't even recover too many Acinetobacters, but we do want to be reporting the most up-to-date breakpoints. So any breakpoint changes that you routinely use and report out, you definitely want to update. And I actually am maybe partial. I'm like still very excited about this anaerobic antibiogram. It's only March and we've gone into it a couple times already on the bench to kind of help direct, whether or not we're going to work up an organism. We know the patients on Piptazo empirically, like, let's look at our antibiogram and see if these bugs that we, found in this culture are, susceptible to what the patient's currently on, and how much we want to work up these anaerobes. So I certainly feel like there's a lot you can do with it, and I do know that the ad hoc working group who was working on the anaerobic worked really hard, and they're going to be following up with a couple publications. And I'm sure us and outreach working group at CLSI will probably follow up more on how to use this antibiogram. So from the laboratory perspective, I would be pretty excited about that.
One thing that it's on my bucket list, and I want to one day, because I know like the CLSI has those meetings there, twice a year, right? And I think that sometimes they're here in Orlando, which last time they were meeting here, I completely missed them, but hopefully one day. I was thinking about something you mentioned, which is interesting about that you don't recover too much Acinetobacter in your lab. It's curious because we get so many in ours, so it's interesting, right? All the changes between labs and areas, of course. Okay, so one thing that when you look at the M100 tables, right? So when it comes to the antimicrobial agents, they're categorized into different tiers for testing and reporting. And I was wondering, for the audience, can you explain what the tiers mean and how labs should use them when deciding which agents to test or report?
Yeah, so the tiers were introduced maybe several years ago, but prior to that, we had categories like A, B, and C. And those categories have been in the document since its like inception, since the 1970s. And what happened was, over the years, our overall profile of an organism such as E. coli, which were very susceptible, very predictable to certain drug patterns, has really evolved over time. And so the categories that are drugs that were in category A, B, and C maybe didn't apply to today's contemporary isolates. And then the fact that we have additional new antimicrobials, like many of the new beta-beta lactamase combo inhibitors and or agents like sapidocol, and we're like, well, where do these newer agents belong in this table? So there was a whole revamp of the table to tiers 1, 2, 3, and 4. And so if your drugs fall into tiers 1 and 2, that's drugs that are typically on your primary panel, your primary test. So if you were going to bring on disc diffusion, you want to think about what drugs you want to put on your disc diffusion Kirby Barrow plate, you would go to tier 1 and say, I want all these drugs, and then perhaps, a second plate for tier 2 drugs, but things that are readily available that you have on hand that you can test. And then agents that you maybe don't have a lot of organisms with resistance, or maybe not on formulary, or your volume is just really low and it's not worth bringing on. You rather do send out tasks. Those would fall into your tier 3 or tier 4 agents. And so those are really customizable depending upon how much resistance you have. And so if you have a lot more resistance, you may want those beta-beta lactamase inhibitors, which are in tier 3, on a primary panel and tested right away because you're going to be using them much more frequently than a place that doesn't have a whole lot of resistance. And so you're kind of using the antibiotics were placed into the tiers based on, what ones we should always have available, which is ones we can use secondarily set up or send out to test. And then also you can do cascade reporting based on the tiers. That's very institution specific. Some institutions want to send out all their antimicrobials because their physicians want to see everything, and others are have a much more aggressive or active stewardship group. They're like, let's kind of hold back some of these susceptible carbapenems. If my ceftriaxone is susceptible, I don't need to put out the susceptible meropenem because they can be treated with a ceftriaxone for, like, say, an E. coli. However, if that E. coli is resistant to ceftriaxone and resistant to cefepime, then you definitely want to release that carbapenem. And then you also want to release, probably, if that carbapenem is resistant, one of your beta-lactamase inhibitor agents, like Septaz, avibactam, in tier 3. So you can kind of cascade across the tier or even within the tier. We recently got a question from someone outside the United States, also trying to interpret these tables. Now, they were really designed for US laboratories, and they have to be a little bit more customizable for those outside the US who have different drugs on formulary and maybe different resistance patterns. But to remember that within a group or in a box, you don't have to be resistant to every single organism to cascade over, because you're not going to maybe have vertipenem, imipenem, and meropenem on your panel. And so to cascade over to a beta-lactamase inhibitor, you only really need one of those carbapenems resistant, and then you might want to release another agent. And so just thinking about, it's not like an all or nothing. It's definitely sort of I would say, kind of more customizable approach to the tables. So.
Okay, and one thing that you mentioned was a lot of the changes was regarding astronam avibactam. So there are testing recommendations and breakpoints for enterobacterialis. Can you talk more about these?
Yeah, so this is a new drug that has activity against the metallo-beta-lactamase enzyme, or organisms that have metallo-beta-lactamases that are of the Enterobacterialis. It's only for Enterobacterialis to have the MBLs. And this is a great drug because we didn't have a whole lot of options. Like our Septaz AV, our Imirel, they were not effective against the metallo-beta-lactamase organisms. So now we have this drug that is specific for them, or has the ability to inhibit them when they have the metallo-beta-lactamase. So specifically, organisms that contain NDM or VIM or IMP. Also, what's exciting about this aztreonam avibactam is that it's a little bit more, it's easier to test in the laboratory than, say, sulfitocol, which also has activity against the metallo-beta-lactamase. So it gives us like another option for our clinicians, maybe something we can perform in-house as opposed to sending out for sulfitocol testing. In our laboratory, we recently just brought it on because we are seeing more NDMs than we are KPC now. And so this has been a frequent request. It's also important to note that if your organism is aztreonam susceptible, it will be aztreonam avibactam susceptible. But many of those organisms that have the metallo-beta-lactamase also harbor like serine carbapenemases or ESBLs or oxas, and then that aztreonam is going to be resistant, but they'll still remain active to aztreonam avibactam, because that avibactam can now inhibit that serine carbapenemase, allowing the aztreonam to work.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. And I invite the audience, if well, if you're working in micro, it should be somewhere over maybe, but if not, I invite you to read about this, and it's very fascinating, as you mentioned. And one of the things with yeah, when I first learned about astronom, and it just is very fascinating. And one thing, and this is just very nerdy, but right, one of the ways that we tested for in the lab was, right, we did the synergy with astronom, because then avibactam was together with ceftazidime, which is the drug Avicaz, and I don't know, it's always such a cool nerdy thing, right? When you see that it's just completely resistant, and then you do that synergy and you see the activity. So I don't know. I think it was a cool nerdy thing. So I just wanted to mention that. Okay. One of the other updates was the revisions to the aminoglycoside breakpoints for Acinetobacter species. What prompted these changes?
Yeah, so these Acinetobacter breakpoints for the whole organism group were set many, many years ago. And as a working group within CLSI, they've been systematically reviewing the different drug classes with Acinetobacter. And so remember, last year we revised the tetracyclines and we removed breakpoints for tetracycline. We updated the minocycline breakpoint. So now this year we're systematically looking, or this current year that we published, we were systematically looking at the aminoglycosides. And so we're basically using some contemporary isolates, maybe revising the PKPD data experiments or reapplying that data to these new isolates and looking at clinical data, clinical failure data to reassess, is this breakpoint that was set many, many years ago still accurate? And in case of the aminoglycosides, they maintain the breakpoints for gentamicin, tobramycin, and amikacin, but lowered it by one dilution. So what were formerly, I believe, 4, 8, and 16 for gent and tobra are now 2, 4, and 8. And then for amikacin, it was formerly 16, 32, and 64, and now it's a dilution lower at 18, 16, and 32. So just one dilution lower for that. It's a little bit more applicable to today's Acinetobacter isolates that we're recovering in our laboratory.
Okay, and then speaking of of aminoglycosides, one of the changes was the temporary removal of tobramycin diffusion breakpoints for Acinetobacter and the direct from blood culture testing tables. Just to give the audience a little bit of context and background, can you explain why CLSI sometimes temporarily removes breakpoints and what labs should do when they encounter this type of changes?
Yeah, so we temporarily remove them when we are looking at the data. And the original breakpoints were set on the old tobramycin disk diffusion diameters, which correlated to the old tobramycin breakpoint. And so once the subcommittee accepted the new breakpoints for the standard disk diffusion and MIC testing, we knew we had to pull out the direct disk data because we hadn't evaluated it with the new breakpoint or the new disk diffusion diameters. So when we say temporary, it means that it's on our radar. We're currently reviewing the data, looking at the data, but we only vote twice a year for the following year's document. And so if the data is not reviewed during that time period, and at that point we didn't know what the breakpoint was, and so we couldn't review the data until the breakpoint got approved. And so now this year we can revise that data set and then put it up for vote so it gets approved in 2026 so that it'll be published in the document 2027. And I think you've seen this also. I think we temporarily removed disk diffusion breakpoints for the Neisseria, just the disk diffusion, because we approved the MIC breakpoints first, and then we have to do the correlation studies to set the new disk diameters. And that data wasn't ready in time for vote. So then we review the data in the following year. So when it says temporary, it just means that it's undergoing review at that moment and just didn't make it in time for that vote for that year. We're basically a year behind in terms of like publishing what we're voting on. Yeah.
Okay. And a little side note for the audience, we're talking about disk diffusion and something that came to mind when you in the lab, it's very typical that we have the stampers, right, where you have multiple, so we can put many several discs on the medium. And one of the things that's very frustrating as a tech working the bench is when you're gonna stamp and nothing comes out or only half of them come out. So one thing I found out is there's a lock and an unlock position. So before you do anything on your plate, test it. If there's no resistance between unlocking and locking, you should be good to go. If you encounter resistance, that means that either you're out of a disk or one of them it's in the wrong position. So just remove them, place them again, lock, unlock, unlock, and no resistance, go for it. It will save you headaches. So that's a little tip that I encountered with trial and error and being frustrating when that happens. It's like, oh my goodness, like 3 or 4 discs come out and then others are stuck there. And it's time consuming, right? And as you know, that's time that we don't have. So we're very busy on the bench. So just something to keep in mind,
That's a great tip.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, I was doing the quality control weekly. So that's something that I'm like, okay, let me see this, and it was very frustrating that those things, and if you unscrew them and take them apart, you're done. They're very hard to put back together. So something for you techs out there to remember. Okay. I mentioned this, and one of the major changes last year, right, was the complete removal of the breakpoints for Burkholderia cepacia complex. And we talked about the challenge that many labs face was finding reference labs that could perform the susceptibility testing, right, using the recommended method. Since that change, how has the situation evolved? And what advice will you give labs when they need susceptibility testing for this organism?
So, CLSI still recommends the frozen reference broth microdilution method or plate. And we put in this distinction there that frozen refers to the reference broth microdilution because we can buy like lyophilized plates, like our microscan plates are lyophilized, and our sensitizer ones are lyophilized, where you just kind of reconstitute with chloronic water, and then you have essentially a broth microdilution tray. But that is not the same thing as the actual reference method, where the drugs are diluted within in the cation adjusted Mueller-Hitton broth, and then they're usually made in bulk and then frozen. And so the problem is that who's doing this? Many clinical laboratories don't have the ability to make their own panels in house. And then even our reference laboratories, we found out, weren't using the reference broth microdilution method. I do believe you can purchase custom panels from some of distributors, like you customize, make them, and ask them. But I don't know how frequent you can purchase them, make them in bulk, or purchase them in bulk and stuff. And so, am I aware of reference laboratories right now using reference broth microdilution? Um, I don't think like, I'm unsure, and so that's probably a question I'll have to ask uh, one of my colleagues who works at ARUP, because I know they were thinking about it. We recently had to send a Burkholderia cepacia on a patient who it was potential transplant recipient for a heart transplant. And so they had a line infection with Burkholderia cepacia complex, but not a CF patient. This is like an immunocompromised transplant, about to go on a transplant patient. And so we sent theirs out to our reference lab, ARAP, at the request of our infectious disease transplant physician doctor. And we knew we were going to get just back MICs. And it said custom MIC panel, but I don't know what custom is. Custom because it's custom dilutions, or is it custom because it was frozen? And so I don't know. Luckily, our MICs were quite low, what we would expect in this patient, but nothing to use to interpret them. And then again, we lost the ECVs this year, which was fine because we don't want to be using our ECVs to make clinical determinations anyway. And so I definitely would urge our laboratorians out there listening is to just kind of contact your reference lab, whatever commercial reference lab you're using, and just ask them what panel they're using for for Burkholderia cepacia testing. They may be using the sensititer panel. It actually performs not not terribly. There was recent publication on its performance. So it's not the worst case scenario. And it's something we still struggle with, because there are patients that truly do need some sort of guidance. I think, in this patient, they were looking for just something to treat or to eradicate their B. cepacia before they went on the heart transplant list. So.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about quality control, right? So when it comes to quality control, are there any updates in this edition that laboratories should be aware of?
Nothing major. Like last year, we made major changes in like frequency and testing or performing QC. This one, for a clinical lab, maybe the big change is we adjusted the imipenem QC range for integrity checks. If you're testing the beta-lactam combo agents, like a lot of times you want to test that QC strain with imipenem before testing it with imirel, to make sure that QC strain is indeed resistant to imipenem. And so it maintained its resistant plasmids, and then you can use it to QC your actual imivactam antimicrobial agent. And so that was one change. I think that, though, was just for broth microdilution. So if you're making your own broth microdilution trays, something that clinical labs aren't doing, I don't think we adjusted the diffusion for that range. And then there's some footnote updates that we made. And when you go through the document, whether I guess on Eclipse or M100 PDF or even online, look for one, the overview changes. That way you can kind of quickly review what's been changed in each section. But also we bold every new edition, or each edition revision that's new to the document is bolded. So when we update some footnotes, you'll see the footnote will have just the updated, the bolded language in the footnote. So kind of take a look at that.
Okay, and for this question, I know that maybe you can give like some sort of general answer, or because it's a little complicated, but right. So the M100 is updated yearly, as we mentioned, and when we get these changes, right, and I know that sometimes changes come out, and people in the lab might feel overwhelmed or maybe not know what to do and things like that, and so when a new edition is released, what steps should microlabs take to review the updates and make any changes and implement them safely in the workflow?
I definitely recommend the webinar for sure. That usually comes along with purchase of the document. Um, and now our webinars are recorded, so you don't have to listen live. You can always come back and listen to it. And we recently did a QA session with that. Uh, we also, within CLSI Outreach Working Group, we will put out two newsletters, usually like a spring and a fall, that will cover any of the new updates in the M100, or just things that are significant that we think our users may want to need to know more information on or be aware of. So, if you don't have an opportunity to get on the webinar or read anything from the CLSI website, definitely check out, like I said, that overview of changes section at the beginning of the document. Take some time to sit down with your supervisor, your lead techs, maybe if you have a pharmacist or ID doctor. I know not everyone has access to a full team, to kind of strategize on like what do we need to do first? What's our low hanging fruit? Like I said, if you're an institute that doesn't have isolate, for the last 3, 4 years, we never need to have Acinetobacter on our antibiogram because we just didn't have enough isolates. And so if you don't have a whole lot of Acinetobacter, you may not think about doing your aminoglycosides right away. You do have if you're CAP accredited, though, I should say, you do have a time period that you have to eventually update those breakpoints. But that would be like one of my strategies. Same things like definitely go through your QC. You're doing disk diffusion, disk diffusion with disk diffusion QC ranges. You want to look for any updates there, any bolded highlights. Make sure that those are all up to date because that's most important. You want to make sure your QC's within range. Um, I'm trying to think strategize wise, and any sort of questions that come along throughout the year, like if your physicians come to you and say, "Oh, I want to bring on this new drug, aztreonam," then you have the breakpoints and the ability to bring it on if needed. So.
Yeah, and as always, definitely do that. And always any questions. As I always like to say in this podcast, people are always very reachable. So something that you're confused and you're unable to answer, even when I got started, I sent like a general email to CLSI and I got the response really quick. And people like you and others that they just you send an email, and people are really good about responding and answering questions. So always keep that in mind. Even if you can find the answer, there's a whole network of people out there that are very nice and are willing to help always. So just remember that. Okay, and when it comes to I asked this last year, and when it comes to the M45, right? Which just for real quick for the audience, it has information on organisms like you have like micrococcus and lactobacillus have breakpoints. Right, the talk was that it was coming out this year. Right, any updates on that? Is it coming out this year or is it next year? What can you tell us about that?
I know, I've been waiting for this document, and it is slated to go out in January of 2027. So we have, what, about 9 more months before it comes out. But it is definitely new and improved. We have some additional organism groups like a Chromobacter and the Pseudomonas non-aeruginosa Pseudomonas species are now have their own table in M45. We have some additional breakpoint revisions, and a little bit more clarification on when to, I always go to it like, should I be working this up? Yes or no? Should we be sending it out for susceptibility testing? So some additional clarification on that. Um, we have some disk diffusion breakpoints now for Aerococcus. So a lot of great work went into it. And so just one more, not even less than a year now away, and it'll be coming. So, and I'm sure CLSI will follow up with additional like webinars and publications. There's always additional information that we put out throughout the year.
And hopefully we can chat about it when it comes out. I mean, like I always, like we've been doing. I mean, I always wait till it comes out. Then CLSI does their webinar, and then I'm like, okay, let me reach out and see if we can do an episode for the audience. Um, so as we, as the episode starts coming to a close, any closing thoughts, anything that you want to tell the audience, or anything else that you want to talk about?
Well, I definitely want to reiterate what you just said, is reaching out to CLSI. Absolutely. We just we get customer inquiries all year round. So just by emailing, I think customer service, CLSI, the questions get directed to any one of the members in the CLSI subcommittee, depending upon the question. And we always answer via email. So definitely encourage our users to, send your questions, or if you see me at a conference, more than welcome to come up and ask questions. I think keeping in mind, like I talked a little bit about the Acinetobacter systematic update. So we just finished up with aminoglycosides, and now the group is currently looking at cephalosporins. So kind of be on the lookout for some cephalosporin changes in that Acinetobacter group next year. I think exciting for me, I always like when we kind of update things that have been in the document for a really long time. And right now we have some working groups working on intrinsic resistance and the definition of intrinsic resistance. So I foresee some changes in that appendix as well. I can't say if they're going to come in 2027 or the next year, 2028. It depends on how things are presented and get voted on, but definitely some new updates to um, that appendix as well. And then I guess, also we're looking at oral cephalosporins and the intravectoralis. That's a question that we get quite often, especially, about cefalozolin as a surrogate for uncomplicated urinary tract infections and the three different organisms. And does it apply to all the oral cephalosporins? Sometimes we know that our other oral cephalosporins are used alone, like outside of urinary tract infections. And so I definitely think, well, not definitely think, I know there's work being done on them, and I hope that there'll be some changes in the future to be published. And like I said, I know we frequently get questions surrounding that. So, always exciting stuff going on.
Yeah, no, definitely exciting. So for the audience, stay tuned, and as always, as changes come in and things like that, I will try to keep you updated of what's happening. Okay. Um, as I mentioned, this question, I always enjoy the answers, and we tend to have for any number of reasons, we have a favorite bug or least favorite one. That's also valid, but it's always a maybe very common is that you work in school with it, and so has some significance. It could be a color, a pattern, or anything, something with susceptibilities or mechanism. Any number of reasons we have that favorite bug. So, April, what is your favorite bug?
Man, this I feel is such a hard question. This is like asking a parent who's their favorite child. Like as a microbiologist, I love all microbes. And I was like, "Ah, I don't know what my favorite one is." It probably depends on, you know, the week or what's going on, but I'm going to say this week, or actually it was last week, we identified our first Staph argentis. And I thought that was really exciting because I've heard about it for a couple years now, and what it was a staff that just wasn't behaving. So again, we thought it was Staph aureus. It just wasn't giving us the right MOLI ID. We're like, what's wrong with you? You're supposed to be a Staph aureus. And then finally, our tech was like, well, I'm going to try the RUO side of the MALDI database, and that's when it came out as Staph argentis. And so I thought that was really exciting. And so, Staph is I wouldn't say is my favorite, but it's definitely the most frequently isolated, and it can be totally tricky. Sometimes it's doesn't behave the way it should behave. And it also keeps me employed. If we didn't have Staphylococcus species, we wouldn't have microbiologists. So I'm going to give it the nod to staff in general.
That's a great, and that's so exciting. Yeah, having identified that. Yeah, I wonder. Yeah, it's just that's, and I always tell the audience this, but yeah, that was the first episode that I did with a guest. Back in 2021, it was about the Staph aureus complex, and so it's always in my radar, and that was the first time that I talked to someone about it. So okay, such a great answer. Well, as always, thank you for taking the time. It's been great, and I appreciate you coming over here to update us of the changes. So thank you for taking the time to be in Let's Talk Micro.
Great. Thank you for having me.
My pleasure. Well, there you have it. I hope you enjoyed this episode. As always, I enjoy sharing this information with you. And, stay tuned when the M45 comes out, the latest edition, which is, April said it was on next year, 2027. I will do an episode about it. So stay tuned. And hey, I wanted to take a moment to thank you, as always, for your support and to share with you that Let's Talk Micro passed 225,000 downloads. And that is, of course, thanks to you for downloading episodes and sharing them and listening to them. So thank you. And of course, this is always thanks to you for downloading episodes, for sharing content. So I am so grateful. And if you're listening to this, hey, go to our socials and make a comment. I want to hear what's your favorite episode, what's your favorite bug, or anything that you want to share. So I am looking forward to your comments. Okay, so as always, Let's Talk Micro is available on all podcast platforms. So if you go to Apple, Spotify, Amazon Music, Goodpods, you can find us there. So please subscribe to the podcast, download episodes, and if the app allows you to do so, please leave a review. As far as social media, you can find us on Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, Blue Sky Social as Let's Talk Micro, on X as Let's Talk Micro 1, LinkedIn as Luis Plaza. There's also the website, letstalkmicro.com, and an email, letstalkmicro@outlook.com. So either via social media or via email, you can send any feedback, any comments, any topic suggestions. They are always welcome and appreciated. And definitely check out the website where you can find licensing information, study tools, episode updates, and more. And one thing that is challenging in this field, right, is learning about antibiotics. So if you want to learn more about antibiotics, please check out www.learnantibiotics.com and the Learn Antibiotics book available on Amazon. These resources include cheat sheets, practice tests, games, and more, and they are being used by thousands of people worldwide and may be helpful for you or your colleagues. Of course, these are some great resources from Dr. Timothy Gauthier, a very passionate pharmacist. If you want to support Let's Talk Micro in any way, you can do so via Venmo or via Buy Me a Coffee, KOFI, both links available on the show notes. And the Let's Talk Micro podcast is supported by the American Society for Microbiology. To learn more about microbes, visit asm.org. And that, micro friends, it's the end of this episode. I hope you enjoy learning about the latest updates for the CLSI M100 2026 edition. As always, I enjoy sharing this information with you. And once again, hey, thank you so much for the support. We reached 225,000 downloads. That's amazing. Thank you so much. Thank you for listening, for supporting us. I appreciate it. And please continue bringing that passion to what you do. It's so important. You do such a great work. As always, stay motivated, stay safe, and of course, continue talking micro. Until the next time. Bye.